Hey, Restorers, welcome to season 2 of Chasing the Vision in partnership with Violand Management Associates and Exit Strategies. I am really excited to be back with all of you. Season 1 went really well, and we were able to answer a lot of questions regarding kind of the path to exiting your company, or if you're getting ready to exit, maybe even looking way into the future, 10, 20 years from now, what that looks like. Leadership, building your team, company culture, right-hand person beside you, all of these different topics we talked about in season 1. So season 2 is here, and we're excited to talk about a very kind of personal journey that Violand Management Associates just went through with the transition of Chuck Violand transferring ownership over to Tim Hull, and kind of what that whole process looked like. JT was a big part of that, kind of as a broker and I think a consultant through this journey. I know that it took many years to get here, and there was some succession planning involved in all of that. So this is just one of the topics we're going to talk about in 2025. We're also going to talk about, hey, if 2024 was hard, you're not alone, and how to recover from a year like 2024. That's going to be another episode and many other great topics. But we wanted to start the year off with a bang. So we're very excited to have Chuck Violand joining us as a guest on this episode. So, all right, I'm going to actually, let's see, I'm trying to decide who to have introduce themselves first. So, JT, I'm going to toss it to you first. JT Kraai with Exit Strategies. Go ahead and introduce yourself for people who might be new to the series.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I am proud to be here this morning with this esteemed group, especially Chuck and Tim and all that they went through. So happy to be part of it. My company is called Exit Strategies. I've been selling companies for 25 years, the last 17, 18 of which have all been in the disaster restoration and trade service space. I reside in St. George, Utah, just outside of Zions National Park, and have clients on a national scale.
Perfect. All right, and Tim, the other co-host kind of the series.
Yeah, it's great to be back, and to all the listeners out there, apologize for the the little lapse in episodes there. We were busy getting a business deal done, but yeah, as of the first of the year, I'm the new owner of Violand Management. Thank you to Chuck, and we welcome him as our first guest of the year, very appropriately. But Violand Management been in business. We've been doing this for coming up on 38 years now. We help small business owners in the trade grow their businesses. We work with clients throughout the U.S., Canada, Australia. It's been a great ride. So looking forward to season 2 of our podcast series.
Awesome. All right, and Mr. Violand, last but certainly not least, go ahead and kind of introduce yourself and give your background.
Mr. Violand, I have to look for my father. First of all, I'm really flattered and honored to be asked to be part of this group here today. Thank you guys and Michelle very much. Now, I'm the previous owner and the founder, still the founder.
Founder.
Yeah,
Always.
still the founder, the previous owner. I'm getting used to that. I'm trying to adjust to that still. Violand Management. And like Tim says, we've been at it now for 37, 38 years. And while I'm still involved with the company, my role is slightly different, and certainly the hours are not what they used to be. Thanks to Tim.
Not what they used to be. That is a gem. The hours are not what they used to be. Yes. All right. So we're here to talk about planning for a successful management buyout. That is what's happened here. Somebody that was on the team instead of an external buyer or PE group or whatever that may be, and what that looks like. So JT, I'm going to toss this one to you first. When should an owner start planning for a management buyout? Like, were you talking to Chuck many years ago? Did you know that all this was playing out? How soon should somebody be starting the conversation or thought process of, I have somebody on my team that might be a good future owner?
Well, I think there was about 4 questions in there.
There
I'll
was.
just address the one. So I'll take the simple one first. I think the first time you mentioned this to me, Chuck, it was a couple years ago. It wasn't years in the making. And, we've got this old notion that we've got to start with the end in mind. And if you're going to start your business today, you've got to think about it 30 years from now. That is really hard to do in this space, especially. There's a lot of owners who can barely see past Friday or the end of the month, let alone 3 or 5 or 10 years down the road. So the ideal way to plan is different than the reality of planning. That's really what it comes down to. We want people to think ahead, but when it comes to people on your team and what the possibilities are, there's really, I think, 3 key questions, because I get this a fair bit. I've done a dozen, maybe 18, management buyouts over the years. And the first question is, do you have a willing party? And the reason I say that is that sometimes there's a comment made in passing like, oh, I'm not going to own this company forever. And somebody sitting around a table says, I'd love to buy it. And pretty soon we've got two parties leaving a 1 hour meeting thinking they've got a deal put together, and it's years down the road. And so because of that, all sorts of assumptions can be made, and they're typically not good. So we've got to have willing, and then we've got to have capable. There's people who want to buy a company and they're just not capable. They probably don't have the skill set, they don't have the financial acumen, they haven't put in the time. So we've got to have capable, and then we've got to have able. And able is when I'm talking to the Tims of the world who want to buy a business, and in this case, it was, I think, just perfect. But it's different when somebody says, oh, yeah, I want to buy. And I say, have you gone home and talked to your spouse about mortgaging your house or an SBA loan? Oh, no, no, she'll be fine. And I say, no, we really need to get your spouse on the phone because it's often not fine. And there's a lot at stake. And so I think when an owner starts to plan on the inside, it's 18 to 24 months, and on the outside, it's 5 to 7 years based on willing, capable, and able, and who the players are.
Okay. Yes, ask your spouse. That's a great point.
Yes,
I would
agreed.
second that one too, by the way, JT.
Yeah.
So Chuck, at what point how long did you have kind of a succession plan or idea in place? Did you always hope that it would be like, did you envision that this was the way it would go? And at what point did you start to realize, okay, this might be a good route?
Yeah, I had no clue that this was how it was going to go, Michelle. Like JT says, the correct answer is, oh, yes, of course. We followed this plan. Come on. Yeah, I think that JT really hit it on the head when he said, the dream, or at least the common wisdom, is that you always start with the end in mind. But look, we're owners, okay? And typically, in many cases, we're males, and we're going to live forever, right? And so, we don't think in those terms.
Mhm.
And so, I think that the first time that Tim and I really got serious about this thing, Tim, I don't know, you might even have a better idea than I do. I think in the back of our minds, Tim and I have always kind of thought, shortly after he was with us, okay, it kind of became clear that, okay, this is somebody who has the skills to run a business. He has run businesses before. He could certainly do this one. He seemed to have a passion for it. And I think more important than anything was that he and I shared a common set of values, similar upbringings. And so it was a good fit, cultural fit for the company. The company had an opportunity to get to know Tim and his style, which is radically different than mine. Everybody that knows the two of us knows that. So I'm going to guess probably 5, 10 years ago. I think, we weren't talking about it at that time. I think we were both thinking about it at that time. I joke that it was years ago, shortly after Tim started with us, that we were doing our program down at Captiva, and we were out to dinner with the company, just our company out to dinner. And my youngest son's nickname is Moose. Okay. Not because he's particularly big, it's just a nickname that he has. And so we're sitting there at dinner, and somehow the topic, now our spouses are there. So somehow the topic comes around to the future of the business. And Tim goes, so okay, I get it now. So it's going to be either Moose or Tim. Moose or Tim. And I'm thinking, well, I never really thought in those terms. I knew that it wasn't going to be Moose, and I love my son, but it wasn't going to be Moose. But that was the first inkling that I had of Tim even being interested. And that was a long time ago.
Okay, so
And then 3 years ago, and this is a long way around this thing, Michelle. I hope I'm not
nope, you're fine. Keep going.
elaborating too much.
Oh.
I think 3 years ago, we really formalized it with some changes, organizational changes we made in the business. And while Tim and I had been talking about it, just anecdotally, I think it became pretty clear to both of us, but also to the company that, you know what, this is really the direction we're going to head.
Chuck, that's an important delineation. I think that the listeners really, especially if you're thinking about doing this, and particularly with a management buyout scenario, there's discussion and then there's decision. Right? We had been discussing it for, like you said, the better part of 10 years, I think.
Yeah.
At least that's where my mind was going at this point. I need to start preparing myself for that day eventually. But I think it was about, I would say in that 3 to 5 year window, I know specifically three, where you had you came to me and said, look, do you really want to buy this? And I
Mhm.
know that question was posed on more than one occasion. So JT, to your point, people can talk about it in passing or, while you're eating lunch one day or whatever, and you think you've got a deal, but it's not a deal. There's a lot of things that need to be considered. And until you go home and you sit down and you talk to your spouse and you say, I'm all in on this and I need your support, until you've got that support, you don't have a deal. So I'd
Right.
say, yeah, that 5 to 10 year window to start thinking about it and discussing it. And then you get inside of 3, you need to start making some decisions.
And you and I, Tim, we were pretty far down. Shoot, it was last year that I still asked you that question. Do you
Absolutely.
still want to own the business?
Yeah.
Do you still want to buy it?
I still ask myself that question today.
I bet.
Too late. Sorry. Uh, Tim, do you have any advice for other people who might be listening, thinking, I would maybe love to own the business I work for in the future, but I don't know how to have that conversation? Any
Oh,
advice on how to walk into that conversation or kind of plant seeds that are respectful?
yeah. I mean, look, I think everybody's scenario is different. Ours, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, there's an age difference between Chuck and I, and we've got. I watched him go through his generational, shift and move, and I think it was just natural for us. We've one generation's taking over for the next generation, and that's really the vision that we have for VMA. And I'll be looking for the next generation to take over too. But as far as having that conversation, I think you need to make sure that you understand that you have a shared vision for the organization for one, because that makes life a lot easier.
Mhm.
If you're the prospective successor and you've got a different plan for the business, and you're talking to the person who founded it and they have one picture for the business in the future, you've immediately got conflict there. So, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I mean, people who take over businesses, buy businesses and transform them into something different. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think, getting on the same page is the first step. Um, and especially if the owner has, um, thought of selling it to private equity or using it as their retirement income. Those are a lot of factors that go into that. But how you approach it, I don't think it's too early. Even at maybe a young tenure, if that's the desire that you have, I think approaching that person and say, have you considered your exit strategy or your exit plan? And talk to them about that. It's a good way of breaking the ice and um, yeah, put the interest out there.
And, we were talking about management buyouts, Michelle, not family. And JT was hitting on a couple really great points there as far as the ability and the willingness.
Mhm.
And my experience in watching families try to transition, some successfully, some not, family businesses, and there's just a whole lot of baggage that goes along with that. And in my particular case, I've got 4 kids. My wife and I have 4 kids, as you know, and probably only one of them is really hardwired to run a business.
Mhm.
Um, but none of them ever expressed an interest in running Violand Management, even being a part of it. And so, you know what? And they're all in their own careers, which is, I mean, you can't ask for anything more than that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
but I think that too many times as business owners, we automatically think, or at least culturally, we're taught that, well, your kids are going to come up and take your business over and blah, blah, blah. No, that a lot of times that doesn't work out like that. And it doesn't work out well, even when it does transition that way.
And business ownership is not for the weak, and restoration in general is an interesting industry in and of itself. So I've talked to restoration company owners who have kids who have maybe thought about it, and they're like, I don't know if I really want this path for them. I don't know if this is the right path, which, it's a little bit different direct restoration company. But JT, do you see any like common missteps that owners make when they're starting to think about succession planning, or maybe see somebody on the team like Tim that might be somebody good to buy the business?
Boy, loaded question. The yes, short answer. The first question I think that happens is, and Tim hit on it. It's a shared vision. Okay, I call it a global picture. There's not enough questions that are asked. We've got this assumption. and people run with those assumptions. And now Tim and Chuck are both great communicators. They were open, they were honest, they told each other where they stood, and this has been in the makes for a long time. What happens is owners and employees alike tend to go down the road with these assumptions. And I get many calls. They go sort of like this, Michelle. They'll say, I want to sell to my key employee, but he doesn't have $10 million. He doesn't have $20 million. He can't buy it. Like, well, what gave you the idea you needed $10 million? Well, that's what a private equity would have written a check for. And they just think that's the only scenario. So there's all of these financing mechanisms that we can use between stock option plans or stock redemption plan, and there's 6 or 8 very common ones. And so the biggest mistake is going down the road thinking you've got an answer and it wasn't correct to begin with, nor are you aware of the other 5 answers that might be perfect applications to what we're trying to solve. And so I would say just get educated, get the details, because the owner of the business is in charge. They're the ones driving the bus. Okay. I promise you, and Chuck, you and I have never talked about this, and it's probably been several years, had we, but I'm sure he and Karen had to sit down and think about what their future looked like.
Oh, yeah.
Does it mean to retire? What are we going to do? Where is our landing pad? And without that, especially in the restoration space, if you don't have something pulling you away, chances are you're not ready to retire. And unless you've really thought it through, those the assumptions that both owners and employees make, they'll tank a relationship and a deal very quickly. And then we're in trouble, because now you run the risk of losing a key employee, which is the opposite of what you want to have happen.
Very good. Good point.
Yeah.
JT, I love one of the things I love about the approach that you take to the seller side is that you focus on the intangibles up front. Mm-hmm. And you have those discussions, and I can't emphasize enough being ready to sell. But from a buyer's perspective, I think the same holds true on the other side too. You have to be ready to buy. Mm-hmm. You have to be in the right place in your career. You have to, be in the right place financially. If those things are a wreck to begin with, then the whole scenario is doomed from the very start. But you have to be in the right place to buy the business.
I've always said 2 willing parties is 80% of the deal. And I believe that, 2 willing parties can overcome a lot. It really can. And I think that's what we had here, was 2 more than willing parties. So I appreciate you both for that.
I'll tell you what, I think
bumpy.
I'm sorry?
It could have been much more bumpy, but I appreciate you both for being willing.
Yeah. And you talk about the 2 willing parties, and Tim, you were saying, you need to be ready to buy. An owner also has to be ready to sell. And JT has written a bit about this, and it's really good. And I thought, having gone through this with clients, okay, I've got this thing nailed. I was really wrong about
Not the same.
Oh my word. It was much more emotional than I ever imagined it would be. And I struggled. And look, I hired a coach to work with me through this whole process. And it was my baby. And in many cases, I think it's the same thing with any business owner. It's what they grew up. And yeah, it was tough.
Yeah, and I want to give a word of advice to any key employees out there that are on a management team who are maybe going down this road. Have respect for what Chuck just said. I cannot stress that enough. You have to exercise patience, and you have to have respect for what those folks did in their lifetime and where they're at today.
And to Tim's credit, he was, and I'm not blowing smoke here, but to Tim's credit, he was exceptional with that. And I've worked with Tim for 16 years, and I know how impatient Tim can be, especially with my style and my pace. And to hear him be as patient as he was, there were times when I would get done with a conversation and I'd go, who was that I was just talking to? Really, he was exceptional with that. So to your credit, Tim.
Thank you, Chuck. No smoke intended. I'll still send you a check next month.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, so kind of along those lines, I think that the Violand team knew that this was happening kind of as it was happening. I don't think that this was a secret to anybody there.
No.
What kind of advice would you give other companies that might be going through a similar process? At what point, since this is internal and not an external buyer, at what point do you start letting your team know, hey, this is happening, and kind of groom them for what, or prep them for what's coming in the transition and what that might look like? I don't know who wants to take that first. Tim, go for it.
Yeah.
I mean, in our scenario, Michelle, we were very transparent from the very
Mhm.
beginning. And I think that that's important for a couple reasons, especially when you're talking about a management buyout. Now, if you're talking about a PE,
Yep.
acquisition or even, another type of maybe a Main Street sale, any of those types of scenarios where the buyer and the seller, maybe they don't know each other as well, or the employees don't know who the new buyer is, or they're not aware of what's going on. There's something to be said about confidentiality when it comes to those deals.
Mhm.
Okay, so you need to kind of put that into one bucket. For us, though, given that our main focus was the legacy of the organization, I think starting off from the very beginning and garnering some support. I mean, look, it was important to me, and it was very important to Chuck too, to make this happen. That our team was supportive of it. I mean,
Right.
if I took over and everybody left, that doesn't do us any good.
No.
Certainly doesn't do our clients any good either. So, we were very transparent from the beginning. It was very helpful, especially in a lot of ways. I had internal counsel. Aside from going out and seeking third parties, I've got a bunch of experts in business, and I confided in them in a lot of ways. Now there's certain things that parts of the deal that you keep confidential, obviously price and certain terms and things like that. But yeah, transparency was a great thing for us.
And just as we say that, and JT flattered us earlier by saying that Tim and I are great communicators, and we thought we were. Okay, we think we are. And then you'd get a question from somebody on the staff, and they go, "Well, it'd be nice to know if." We're thinking, "You already know that. We've been all over that. I thought that we communicated this to everybody, but apparently we had not." And so they had a question. It was, some of them had already been through buyouts with other employers that they had
Mhm.
that perhaps didn't go as well or not as transparent as we felt we were being. So we tried our best to be, I mean, we shared everything on many, many, many occasions. And we were always open to questions if they had them. But you still get them and you go, okay, I
Chuck, I
need to
can't
work
help
harder
but
at
I've
that.
got a Tim, let me interject one
Oh,
thought
go
here.
ahead. Yeah.
I'm smiling because in a transaction and and a transition as well, and you've probably heard those differences in my world, but what people say is not always what the other party hears.
Well,
And
Mhm.
things can get twisted so easily, which is why in business, especially in my seat, I communicate very clearly, at least I attempt to, because there isn't room for gray area. And just like Tim said, or like Chuck said, I thought we had communicated that as a team, and we didn't. And you maybe did at one point. It just that's not what they heard, and it happens more times than anyone cares to admit.
Yeah.
and they may have heard it the same, they may have heard the same thing in a previous scenario with another company,
That's
and it
right.
turned out to not be the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody's got some
Perception is,
baggage that they bring to the table sometimes, and that's
Right.
you got to navigate that.
yeah, perception is reality, and people hear what they want to hear.
Mhm.
But I can't help too but think that that little bit of a cynicism in people sometimes too says, "All right, I hear you, but where's the catch?" Or "I'll believe it when I see it,"
Yes.
kind of thing. I got to imagine it's natural for the employees on the other side.
Mhm.
Yeah, change is hard at the end of the day.
Yeah,
It is.
100%.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so both Chuck and Tim, you have kind of teased up the value of having advisors and people in your court throughout this. So at what point did this get official enough that you brought in JT in a more formal capacity, and who else did you both have at your table as you went through this process? Chuck, I'll kick that to you first.
Yeah, JT, when did I reach out to you? 2 years ago or 3 years ago?
Probably two and a half. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, two and a half years ago. I mean, we sort of knew that we were going to go with JT. We knew him and we
Mhm.
trusted him. Both Tim and I trusted him. And so we figured, look, rather than having Tim get somebody and me get somebody,
Mhm.
and then we're going to get together and start hashing over, okay, he said, now we both trust JT. Let's go with what JT has to say. And so we got JT for the valuation of the business. Now we also have an accountant. The company has an accountant
Mhm.
that also serves as my wife's and my accountant. And so we already had him, on retainer, not retainer, but we already had a relationship with Frank. And then Frank was the one who we did not have an attorney. We've had an attorney for a lot of years, good friend of mine that I've known for a million years. He's retired, and I just didn't feel that he was going to be interested in taking on this big of a deal. So we asked Frank for the accountant's opinion on who he would recommend, and he recommended a guy, excuse me, at a law firm that he has worked with on mergers and acquisitions. And so we reached out to him, and that was within the last year.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So
Tim,
I mean,
what
it
about,
came,
sorry, go ahead. Keep going, Chuck.
well, I was going to say it came together pretty quickly, but I suppose that depends on whose glasses you're looking through.
Sure.
For mine, I know. For mine, it was coming together and for my wife, it was coming together very quickly. I think Tim's going, let's go. Come on, we can get this thing done. And I get that. I totally get that. So, yeah.
Tim, who did you have at your table?
Same on my side, Michelle. To your original question, though, which was when should you get them involved? I think once you move from the discussion to the decision phase, and you're like, okay, we're going to do this, the earlier the better. Get your professional counselor or counselors involved as soon as you can. So whether you're working with a business coach like us, or you want to seek out some expert valuation experience like JT, the legal side, the CPA side, like Chuck had mentioned, I had representation for my best interest, counter to Chuck's as well. Get those folks involved as early as you can. But I think the primary one though was JT. Unless you have some common language around how the business is valued, ultimately it comes down to a dollar. Everything else has value in the negotiation, yes, but you got to start somewhere. And if you're miles apart, it doesn't ever get off the ground. So you need to really establish that up front. So um, yeah, seek out somebody who's going to value the business and help guide you through the process.
Yeah.
That's the first step.
And Tim, to that point, it was interesting. And after you saying that just now, it occurred to me that when we were in conversations with Frank, okay, now we've known Frank for a lot of years.
Mhm.
When we were in conversations with him, when we were really getting serious about this, and we were saying it's a management buyout, or general manager wants to buy it, and blah blah blah, and he was asking questions that Karen and I were going, well, no, we're already there. We've been through all that, but he didn't know that. And so he's been through a lot of these different scenarios where, just as JT was saying earlier, the general manager, they may have had a cursory conversation. Yeah, I'm going to sell this thing at some point. And he goes, well, I'll be interested in buying it. And we were way down that path by that point when we started dealing with Frank. And certainly when we started dealing with Lucas. I mean, that the attorney his name was Lucas. I mean, we were way beyond it at that point. So we got a lot of that stuff out of the way ahead of time.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's go down the valuation path then, because that's a big key component to any transaction. I know it was key here. It would be with anybody. So JT, what was your strategy coming in to try to value this company? I know you work with a lot of restoration companies and other types of companies. What was it like going through this process?
Well, every deal is different, of course. There's always a financial component. There's always what I call an analysis, which is all the story variables. And consulting companies are valued very differently than restoration companies, but certainly, in the realm of what I do. So it wasn't complicated to work with Chuck and Karen on evaluation and where they stood and go through the ad backs. They kept a great set of books. And, I can't disclose really anything beyond, generalities here, but the valuation process itself is fairly straightforward. And then it comes down to what do the terms look like?
Mhm.
That's that old adage, you set the price, I'll set the terms, right? And that can be wildly different. there might be kids involved. There might be a GM or a PM or an estimator that's like a family member. They might be involved. You might have somebody that has initially started talking about valuing a business here, and 3 years later, when the transaction actually takes place, it's up here. Well,
Mhm.
then how does that look? There's lots of variables to consider on value and how what's driving it, how you got there, how it's calculated. But at the end of the day, as Tim said, it's got to be fair. And it's in this case, it wasn't complicated to come up with fair.
I'm guessing that you've been through situations where it's complicated to come up with what's fair. So can you speak to that a little bit, like how in other situations with other companies, if it's tough to come to a valuation, what are some strategies you've used with other companies to help them get there?
Yeah, fair is such a relative term. Let me tell you a couple of quick horror stories. Okay. One is going on right now. I've got a husband wife who is actually suing each other, trying to figure out how to best treat their kids. And I'm being brought in to help advise and potentially stop this lawsuit. I about fell out of my chair.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it. Here's another one. Oftentimes, the sellers of a company, in Chuck shoes, they might sell or give some equity, earn in some equity to a GM years in advance. So they've got some skin in the game. Well, if this is a father-son team on the West Coast that he offered 10% because he was the natural heir apparent. And literally within days, he said, the son, fairly entitled son, says, "Thanks, Dad. I don't want the business anymore. I'm moving. And oh, by the way, give me my 10%."
Hmm.
Wow.
There was about $1.5 million at stake in that 10%.
Oh,
So the son never wanted the business. The dad assumed he was the heir apparent, gave him 10% verbally, nothing was in writing. And literally days later, he says, "I don't want it, but oh, by the way, write me a check." You can see how quickly this can spiral out of control. It never spirals into control. That rarely happens. It spirals out of control. And so getting these assumptions pinned down, that clarifies fair. It really does.
Oh, okay, so Chuck and Tim, I know. Were there any surprises for you in the valuation and kind of legal side of this? I think you both knew that this was the direction you were going. It sounds like a valuation that went pretty smoothly, but any surprises in kind of the legal and valuation side of things?
I mean, to the valuation of the business, no. I mean, we do this,
Yeah.
quite often, and
Yeah.
we knew what the business was worth. I mean, it might have been a little surprising to Chuck, but
it's
but
always surprising to an owner.
it is always surprising. But look, at the end of the day, I mean, if you want to get kind of specific with it, and JT, maybe you can speak to it too. The business has to be able to provide enough cash flow to the purchaser, the buyer, to be able to justify the purchase.
Yeah.
Um, Either that or the buyer needs to be bringing enough capital to the table to create an opportunity for what it's buying to generate that cash. Either way, it still comes back to cash flow. People don't buy businesses and then lose money with them, at least not often, right? So there is a sense of reality there, I think, on that side of things. How that translates to the legal side of things, Michelle, I mean that's a whole different story. Lawyers can they can say things in a lot of words. Let's put it that way. But with that said, they do force you to think about a lot of scenarios that, given the time and the effort that you put into it, could avoid very contentious situations down the road, should those things happen. Now, hopefully, none of those things do happen, but when they do, that's usually where you see parties with significant conflicts and lawsuits and things of that nature. So
Yes.
it's time well spent, I think.
Time and money well spent, and don't underestimate the money part. The um, the attorney that we hired did not know us. He did not know Tim. And so he was able to bring clarity to, just as Tim was saying, some of the scenarios that could play out, hopefully never will. I am by nature, I am a glass half full kind of guy, probably 3/4 full kind of guy. So it's easier for me to dismiss or to overlook eventualities that could take place. A good attorney is going to help you not do that and protect yourself. And so I think that that was part of what in our case might have taken a little longer than caused it to take a little longer than perhaps otherwise it might have. But it was well worth it. It makes you think differently. I think
Yeah,
attorneys in general think differently.
Yeah, attorneys will take a 2-page agreement and turn it into a 60-page agreement, much of which has to do what happens if things go wrong.
Yes.
Much like a premise lease, right? If everything went right, it's a 3-page document. When they go wrong, it's 50 pages.
Yep.
Adjusting one word changes the meaning of everything.
Oh, yeah.
Look at it like that. Do any of you, kind of, Chuck, to your point of hiring an attorney that you didn't know, do any of you find value in having some of the people at the table be new people that don't know you well? Or would you recommend bringing only people that do know you well to the table? I know we tend to hire people we know and these kind of things in general. Is there some value to having people, maybe like Chuck did, well vetted, but don't know you intimately and know the personal relationship amongst everybody to get you to the table?
That's an interesting question. Off the top of my head, I don't know that I really have an answer. I mean, I know the attorney that I've worked with for years, the friend of mine. He's an exceptional attorney. Tim knows him. Tim's worked with him on some things. But I just felt that he was at a point in his career, and perhaps he might have felt that he was too close to me to really do it justice. So having somebody that did not know me, but he had a dog in the fight. The attorney had a dog in the fight because he knew our accountant.
Okay.
And so,
Got it.
that was pretty close. He
Tim,
wanted to do well.
Tim, did you know everybody that you brought to the table prior?
Yeah, well, either directly or indirectly, Michelle. So, so on the CPA side, yes, there was a relationship there. On the attorney side, I went with an individual who was part of a firm that I had known. All right, so close personal friend, one of the principals of the firm. He had referred me or recommended that I work with a specific attorney in their firm who specialized in mergers and acquisitions. So, but either way, like your scenario, Chuck, you had a referral there, so there was a trusted connection.
Right.
But I do think there was an advantage. It may have created a little heartburn for us, but there was an advantage to having somebody that we didn't know or two parties that we didn't know discussing things together, because their first obligation was to protect our best interest.
Right.
And they did an excellent job. Both sides did an excellent job at that, to the point where we probably had to, back them off a little bit in certain areas. And many of the terms, like you said, JT, there's the price and there's the terms. Many of the terms we had already discussed. So we had reached agreement on those negotiation points. It was simply how it was worded in the legal contracts for, like you said, those instances where you've got a situation that happens down the road. Those are things that we had not thought of. And I approached it with the same, 3/4 full attitude that Chuck did. But reality is, if something unforeseen should happen, I think we did a good job of structuring a deal that would eliminate heartaches for a lot of people down the road, including ourselves, should those things happen.
And to Tim's point, both his attorney and our attorney, they did their jobs well. Okay. And they came into this thing as they would go into any other negotiation or any other legal document on an M&A, like a dog going after it. Okay. And they did. And there was at least one occasion, there might have even been more than that, when Tim and I both had to, hey guys, look, this isn't just another person, a buyer that's buying this. This is the guy that I've worked with for 16 years. I know him, I trust him, I love him. I think we need to do this thing with a little bit more dignity.
Yeah. Okay, so Tim, I'm going to toss this one to you before we wrap it up. So now the transition is underway, like the transaction is done, the transition part is underway now, more so formally probably. So what has it been like? And it's been a little over a month since the paperwork was signed. So how's it going? And what advice would you give owners or the new owners of a company of like, all right, once you step into it, here's some things maybe that have gone really well and some things that you might do differently now
Yeah.
that you're like stepping into it?
Well, expect the unexpected. I would start with that. You bring up a good point. Just because the transaction side of things is done doesn't mean the work is done. So be prepared for the transition side. And not that it's been rough. I don't think it's been rough on us at all. As a matter of fact, I thought it has been pretty smooth. And JT, you would probably attest to that with some of the things that you've seen. We don't certainly have lawsuits going against our children and things of that nature, but I think there's things that you don't think about, small things, Michelle, that just add up to a lot of work. Um, and they come out of left field. It's like, oh, hey, yeah, you didn't set up this, documentation, or you have to sign this to transfer that, or yeah, and some of it was the way we structured the deal, because it's different for an asset purchase versus a stock sale. But crossing the T's and dotting the I's are interesting. It creates a lot of work, but I think at the end of the day, it's worth it. And I think you can see light at the end of the tunnel more and more every day. Where, hey, let's get back to business, regular business, and I think I'm at that point now where I'm very eager to get back to regular business and start growing the company.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, Chuck and Tim and JT, you all have watched from the other side of the table other companies go through transitions like this. So I'm just curious if you have any advice to other companies that are going to go through this of like, look, we've seen this go really well, or we've seen this go really far south in transitions. There's a lot of conversation in the industry now of the big players, but strategics, as JT calls them, the industry strategics buying other companies, or there's transitions and there's just always things to know. I think you guys sat in a very unique and great position because
We
you
did.
know each other so well and the team knows both of you so well and the Violand team is close as it is. And I think that that's probably a very unique situation. So any advice that any of you would give for this transition period to make it as successful as possible? JT, maybe I'll kick that to you first.
Well, we could do a whole episode on
Yeah.
integration and
Mhm.
transitions. It's a
Yes.
lengthy answer, but the best companies, when they do it, they're very forward thinking. When I integrate, let's say larger companies at 10, 20, 30, 40 million, the integration team is a standalone team, and we'll have integration meetings with 9, 10, 12 people on it. And all they're doing is talking about integrations with software and HR and IT and all the things that go with it. And is learning a few of those things now about this document or that document. And you rarely catch everything, right? It just doesn't happen. There's so much. But if you've ever seen a due diligence list, which will just take people right off their chairs, it's about communicating, setting expectations. And when you've got, you know, 4 or 5 people on one side and 8 or 10 on the other, all working and rowing towards integration, there's not much that gets missed.
Yep.
So to me, it's about let's forecast the next 30 days, 60 days, 120 days, and then forecast out to a year. And the companies who have done it, they know where the hurdles are, they know where the potholes are, and they can avoid them. The companies who haven't done it, it's kind of a landmine field and it's pretty easy to step in. So, based on experience, I can guide accordingly, but you can't over communicate during transition. There's no such thing.
Yeah, expectations play a huge part in that, JT.
Yeah.
I think you're exactly right. These are not, we're not talking about campaign promises here, Michelle. When there are certain things that have to be done whenever you acquire a business. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that mainly the strategics make, the bigger players that are out there in the marketplace, is they paint a rosy picture
Mhm.
for the staff on what it's going to be like. And that was one thing that we did not do. As a matter of fact, I think just the opposite. We made it known that there's a lot of hard work to do. And there's some challenging decisions that are going to need to be made, and we're going to have to do this together in order to make it work smoothly. So you can't just say, "Hey, look, we're going to buy this business and it's all going to be great because here's all the things that we're bringing to the table. That's not always the case.
Not always the case.
And I think we continue to talk to the staff, Tim, both of us.
Mhm.
Just to listen to them if they have questions or concerns after the integration or as we're going through the integration after the purchase. So I think that we continue to keep them informed.
Yeah, and don't overlook the small stuff too. I mean, still to this day, I'll get an email or an IM from somebody in the office say, "Hey, I used to ask Chuck about this, but I guess I'm coming to you now." Like, I never thought to give direction to any employee to say, "Come to me with these questions or to make these decisions." My standard response is, "Well, what do you think?"
Well, was in a meeting with a bunch of the folks in the office just last week. No, it was the week before, and one of the gals in the office, you know her, Karen Tersley, Michelle, our admin director. We're sitting at the table and we're having some kind of discussion, and she leans over to me and she goes, I didn't ask permission to say this, but I am going to say it anyway to the group here. And she said something, and I leaned over to her and I said, I'm not your boss anymore.
It's going to be a transition. It's a transition for everybody. So yeah.
And we laughed.
Yes, that's good. Laughing through it will also help. It doesn't all have to be serious all the time. Yeah. So, all right, before we wrap it up, I'm going to go kind of around the circle. So, Chuck, I'm going to start with you on this one. Biggest lesson that you would give anybody listening to this, the biggest lesson that you are walking away from this whole experience with, it may be specific to a management buyout and somebody going through a management buyout. What have you learned through the selling process?
I'd probably say two things, two big buckets here, Michelle. One of them is the details. In addition to being a glass 3/4 full guy, I am not a details guy. I am a visionary. Okay, so I am impatient. I don't understand all the details that need to be taken care of. And fortunately, there are a lot of people who do. So be patient because there are a ton of details that have to be attended to, and they do. And I don't mean to be dismissive of that, but that is not my favorite place to be. So be prepared for that if you're not a detail-oriented person. I think the other bucket is the emotional piece for an owner. And just be prepared. It's an interesting ride. And I'm still going through it. I'm not over it yet, but it's an interesting ride. So be prepared for that. And don't be afraid to seek counsel for that, to seek out somebody who might help you work through that tough period.
Yeah. Beautiful. All right, Tim, any advice?
I'm going to go to the emotional side, and maybe that's surprising to some who know me. To me, the details and the mechanics are just what they are, right? It's the work that needs to be done, and a lot of it is pretty standard. Surrounding yourself with good people who are intimately aware of what those details and what those mechanics look like JT, is invaluable, because there's a lot of things that are going to go through your mind, and you can't remember it all. So a due diligence list it's very onerous to go through, but it has to be gone through, right? The emotional side, just be prepared. And even as a buyer, we talked about having patience and respect for those who founded the company, those who you bought from, but you'd be surprised at some of the emotions that you go through your own. And even post-acquisition, you never forget your first payroll. So, yeah.
I bet it's bigger than mine was.
Okay, JT, what your final piece of advice here?
Well, I'll just keep this short. I could weigh in a lot on, the comments that have been made about all the hard work and the lists and, don't underestimate it. It's all true. But that falls into this bucket that I have of make good decisions. There's ill-informed decisions and there's well-informed decisions. And if you can just start making well-informed decisions, everything else gets easier. It really does. When they're ill-informed, you can't quite wrap your head around what's happening. And if you think you have the answer and it's not correct, it's going to be a bumpy road. It just is. And that's when deals fall apart. And so if you can stay well informed and ask the right questions, it's going to be much smoother.
Perfect. All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your story. I'm thrilled that I've gotten to talk to you about this twice now, which is very exciting. So, and I think that we talked about completely different things this time around than we did in the other podcast episode we did. So, for everybody who's listening, you can find more Chasing the Vision on YouTube, on the CNR website. You can kind of find it everywhere. And we look forward to doing a lot more episodes this year. The next one is going to be on, hey, if 2024 was hard, you're not alone. Here's how we recover and move forward and push forward in 2025. We're all in that together. So thank you to the three of you. Congrats on getting this deal done. I know that you all had different big roles to play in it. So congrats. And I look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle.